Good evening, everybody. I'm Susan Head. I'm the RCN Director for Scotland, and absolutely delighted to be welcoming everybody tonight and our panel to the event Nursing a Gender Neutral Profession. Really looking forward to a good debate tonight, some really exceptional speakers and an interesting night ahead. So I would like to welcome our chair tonight. Many of you will know Brendan already. He's got both an international and a national reputation. He's got one of the longest job titles that I think I've ever seen as well. He's obviously professor, so fellow of Royal College of Nursing as well, which I'm delighted to see. But he's head of the divisions, I have to read this out, head of the divisions of Nursing, Occupational Therapy and Art Therapies. He's Associate Director, Centre for Person-Centred Practice Research at Queen Margaret University, and Vice President of Omega 11 Chapter at Sigma Global, and many other esteemed titles as well, professorships in Norway, in South Africa, Slovenia, in Australia, Vienna, and more local as well. He's an honorary nurse consultant in Erskine, so brings with him a huge amount of expertise from a practice perspective, policy perspective, and just generally nursing leadership as well. So I'm going to pass over to Brendan now, who's going to be our chair for the evening. And I just wanted to say, as I say, welcome you on behalf of RCN Scotland, and I hope you have a really interesting evening, that you're able to participate in the debate and get as much out of this as possible. So Brendan, thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you for asking me to chair this event, and good evening to everybody. And as Susan said, I'm really looking forward to a really good discussion and some fascinating presentations and some good Q&A around all of this. It's my pleasure as a fellow of the Royal College of Nursing in Scotland to be able to chair this event, and particularly to chair this event focusing on gender in nursing, something that is very topical and something that we're all pretty occupied, and certainly in my role as a head of a nursing department, then it is something we are taxed with paying attention to in a very active way on an ongoing basis. This evening we have a lineup of speakers who are all very well versed in this topic area, and each of them will give a short presentation on their particular focus on this area. And at the end of that, which will be around 6:45, we will then move into a Q&A session. But we would encourage you to post your questions as we go, and we can be pulling them together so we can start directing them to the panel once all the presentations have been completed. If you have participated in this kind of event before, you probably will be familiar with the way it works, and that as an audience member you can't directly connect or speak to a panel member, but you pose your questions, and then I will pose those questions to the panel members on your behalf. My approach tends to be to try and draw them into themes so we can engage in some holistic discussion, but if there's a really good punchy question, then I may pluck that one out as well as we go. So, and we will complete the event at 7:30 tonight. So thank you for joining us and welcome. So before I introduce our first speakers, just to say a little bit about this focus, and particularly nursing as a gender neutral profession. And I guess, you know, as a man chairing this event, then I occupy one of the statistics that possibly will get debated tonight around how men still are very few in relation to the percentage overall in nursing, but we often tend to occupy senior positions, and what is that about? But I think the debate is much broader than that, and I'm hoping tonight we will get under some of the issues there are and that have been an issue in nursing throughout the history of nursing, really, about why it is so heavily focused on being a female profession, or a profession dominated by women. And of course that has been one of nursing's strengths, but also one of the key challenges, in that because historically nursing has been viewed so heavily as a profession for women, then that has had a lot of negative impacts in terms of pay and conditions and rights, something that I hope and I'm sure will get addressed tonight. And of course, we have seen more recently a real concerted effort to bring more men into nursing. And I have to say, even though I'm a head of a nursing department, it's something I have struggled with. And I have struggled particularly with it being one of our targets within our outcome agreement with Scottish Funding Council, where we're expected to increase the number of men. And I struggle with it because it reinforces this binary nature of gender in particular. But I also struggle as to why we kind of focus on men in particular, outwith all of the other issues around gender and rights that need to be addressed in nursing. And for me, just paying attention to men detracts from some of the broader issues that need to be accounted for within the nursing profession. And so therefore tonight, you know, this focus on gender neutrality, I think, is a really important one. And something that I hope will really start to uncover some of the issues that we need to be discussing on a broader issue. So without further ado, I'm going to move us into our first speaker. So our first speaker, let me just get her biography up, is Dr. Heather Whitford. And Heather is a senior lecturer and head of post-qualifying studies in the School of Health Sciences at the University of Dundee. But more significantly, I guess, Heather has been doing quite a lot of work focusing on men in nursing, and has led two particular projects around that, funded by NHS Education for Scotland, and has been chairing the Men in Nursing programme. So I'm going to hand over to Heather to give our short presentation, and her slides are already loaded and ready to go.
Thanks, Brendan. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the Royal College of Nursing for inviting me along tonight. I'm delighted to be here to be able to speak about the work that we've been doing over the last few years. Brendan has kind of preempted some of the things I was going to say as an introduction, because I think, you know, from the outset, this is about widening access more generally into nursing and midwifery and making the professions attractive to the right high caliber applicants of all genders. And we are aiming for a more diverse profession generally, which represents all sectors in society. So that should be inclusive of gender, ethnicity, disability, and other protected characteristics. And as Brendan also alluded to, this work does take a very binary approach to gender, but I think we have to acknowledge that we need to be more inclusive of people who don't identify as either male or female, and make our profession more inclusive more generally. Could we have the title slide, please? Thank you. So really a brief outline of the presentation. I'm going to briefly mention the background situation and the work that led to this RMAN working group, attracting and retaining men in midwifery and nursing. Brendan also mentioned the studies that we've carried out, so I'm going to briefly summarise the projects that we carried out for NES, and some of that feeds into the RMAN group and why it was set up, and what we've been doing over the past 2 years. Could I have the next slide, please? So, as we all know, men are in the minority in the nursing profession. It is a predominantly female profession, and although so we have NMC figures currently show that 11.4% of nurses in the United Kingdom are men. I work in higher education, and our nursing student population has pretty much been around the 8 to 10% men. In 2020, we had 9.1% of nursing students who joined us were men. We have been challenged by the Scottish Funding Council. In 2016, they produced a gender action plan, and it set a target that no subject should have an extreme gender imbalance of more than 75-25 by 2030. We've got some way to go, clearly, in nursing and midwifery to achieve that, but this applies across the board to other disciplines which are heavily weighted in favour of men. So, sort of, for example, engineering, maths, physics, these kind of professions. I think we also have to acknowledge that gender balance has been achieved in many other professions that were predominantly men over the years, so medicine, dentistry, and that the improvement in gender balance has been to the enhancement of these professions. And I think it is interesting that the efforts that have been made to improve the gender diversity of other professions, the more male-dominated, and also the boardroom, are generally accepted and encouraged. Perhaps nursing has lagged behind a little bit in encouraging diversity. We also have the Scottish Government widening access to midwifery, Nursing and Midwifery Commission, which reported in 2017 and also encouraged us that we should be looking at best practice in the area of attracting more men into nursing. Okay, so could we have the next slide, please? So while the work in Dundee started in 2016, I worked with colleagues from across a number of different universities during 2017. We got funding from NES. So the colleagues were from Robert Gordon University, University of Edinburgh, University of the West of Scotland. And we worked together to have a look at why it was that men were underrepresented in nursing in Scotland. Perhaps some of the findings are unsurprising. We interviewed current male students in all 4 institutions. We also interviewed university and college lecturers, and we carried out an online survey to career and guidance teachers. And broadly speaking, across all the participant groups, there were very similar findings. Nursing was seen as predominantly a female profession, but nonetheless, it was a worthwhile career. The men who came into nursing often reported that they had had a positive role model, perhaps a parent who was a nurse, or they had had personal experience of being cared for in hospital, or a family member. And these were influential in helping them to choose to come into nursing. The term male nurse is anomalous. It perpetuates stereotypes and differences, and this was commented across the board. We never refer to a female nurse, but the term male nurse wasn't seen as particularly helpful. In some areas, the provision of intimate care could be problematic for the male students that we interviewed. They were sometimes restricted in gaining the competencies required, and perhaps for that reason, some technical specialties such as accident and emergency or intensive care were seen as more attractive. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, the lower earning potential of nurses was for some men a disincentive for applying. So the conclusion of this work was that we needed to think about how nursing was branded, try and get away from the gender branding of nursing, and to emphasize the skills and capabilities and the positive aspects of nursing as a career, and that universities and colleges could work together, as well as the NHS, to provide high profile examples of men in nursing. Next slide, please. So one of the surprising findings of that first study was that the male students are less likely to complete the programme than our female counterparts, and they often take longer to complete. So we wanted to have a look at this. We felt that, well, all very well attracting more men into our courses, but if they don't complete or take longer to complete, then we're kind of setting them up to fail. So we got further funding from NES, and again, cross collaboration with the other universities mentioned earlier. And our report was published in May 2019. We tried to interview male students who had left a programme of nursing. It was extremely difficult to recruit those people. We only managed to recruit a very few number, but the current male students that we interviewed, current female students, and we also interviewed academics, and similar findings to the few male leavers that we were able to interview. We looked again at the data and found that the younger male students of nursing were the ones who were more likely to leave early and less likely to complete. We didn't have more detailed data to be able to look at that in more depth. The students who we interviewed reported that male students can feel isolated and somewhat vulnerable on programme. Sometimes they don't really fit in with their classmates. If they're the only male student in a class, then they maybe have difficulty relating to their classmates. Because there's so few of them, they often stand out in classroom and in placement. So lecturers remember their names. They're maybe, shall we say, picked on, but maybe asked questions more, or used as examples for examination purposes. The financial pressures, while some of these things affect all students, maybe disproportionately affect male students. We know that male students of nursing are more likely to be older because they often join when they're mature, or they've had come from a different career, and they may then, as a result, be more likely to have financial or family responsibilities. They may be restricted in their learning opportunities, and actually, to a certain extent, need a bit of maturity and resilience in order to be able to cope and overcome. It's maybe easy to dismiss this, but they reported sort of a lot of minor issues, almost minor microaggressions, which cumulatively, for some students, made them feel kind of vulnerable. Again, perhaps we could draw similarities to other minority groups in society. So things that were examples, maybe like the female image of a nurse on a call bell. The nurses round a nursing station, and someone comes in and a ubiquitous greeting to the ladies at the nurses station. In some clinical areas, a lack of changing facilities for their male students. Plus the male nurse, this use of this term male nurse made them feel different. And some of them reported the double consent. The patient might be asked if it was okay if a student gave the care, and then is it okay if it's a male student? So there's this sort of double consent issue. And interestingly, the female students that we interviewed didn't really recognise these as issues. So the conclusion of this work was that there's a need for extra support, both in the classroom and in placement. Unconscious bias training perhaps for staff, both in clinical areas and in lecturers, and trying to make sure that our learning materials represent a diversity of gender, both patient and in professionals, and maybe a slightly more assertive kind of support or mentorship. And another aspect that came out was that men are sometimes slower to seek support, so hence the need for more assertive support. Okay, next slide. So all this work led to, we had a lot of publicity and social media activity at Dundee, and that in conjunction with Athena Swan work, which is about improving gender balance in academia, and looking at career progression. But we also looked at student data. So as part of the Athena Swan work, plus the response to the background, the Gender Action Plan target that was mentioned earlier, the Equality Challenge Unit ran an Attracting Diversity project, and so there was a lot of momentum going on, and a lot of interest from other institutions about the work that we were doing in Dundee. And we had a number of cross-institution meetings in Dundee during 2017-2018. We recognised that we all faced the same challenges and needed to work together to try and attract more men into the professions. NES then agreed to support the activity centrally, and the first NES hosted meeting was held in February 2019. On this slide I put up the purpose of the group, which was as part of our terms of reference. We want to kind of keep an eye on the rates of men in nursing and midwifery, and promote strategies that will to try and increase the number of male applications. As part of our Athena Swan work, we looked at our recruitment processes, and there was no evidence of any gender imbalance in the way we were recruiting our students. We pretty much are getting 10% of our applications come from male applicants, and that's what we have on our programs. So we really need to encourage more applications in order to increase the numbers. The work that we did about higher attrition rates meant as part of the group we also want to look at how we can keep the students that come onto our programs, and by working together across Scotland, make nursing and midwifery an attractive career choice for men. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. So we have representation from all universities across Scotland that provide nursing and midwifery education. We also have representation from the College Development Network and college representatives. We have representation from NES, from the Royal College of Nursing, nobody from the Royal College of Midwives at the moment, and the Scottish Government is represented. And we also have representation from our clinical colleagues across the NHS. We meet 3 times a year, and our reports go to the Chief Nursing Officer and to NES, Council of Deans, and to other groups that are part of our reference group that are listed there. Activity has been somewhat hampered over the last year. Clearly, priorities in the universities have been focused elsewhere in terms of organising and supporting students during the pandemic. But the commitment to the work of the group continues, and we look forward to working together in the future. I think the last slide is really just the references that I have alluded to or mentioned on my. You can just move on to the next slide. So if anybody wants copies of any of these things, the 2 reports that we published have recently been published in journals as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Heather. That got us off to a great start, and certainly sets out some of the territory that we're navigating as we go through this evening. So thank you so much for that. Moving on to our next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Rachael McIIroy. Rachael is Senior Research Lead for Employment Relations at the Royal College of Nursing, and has got a wide background and brief around pay and conditions and the whole kind of environment for which nurses work in. Really, I guess it covers practically everything from what I can see. And she has also been part of a group which was led to a report jointly with Oxford Brookes University looking at gender and nursing as a profession. And I'm going to hand over to Rachael to talk some more about that, I think.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to speak tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you. I've taken a chance and not gone with any slides, so I hope that works out for me and you. As Brendan said, I'm here to talk about the report that came out early last year. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's a big report and there's a lot there, and lots of different quantitative analysis and lots of qualitative themes. But I just thought I'd start with kind of my personal view of why we did the research, because I'm the one that commissioned the research in the beginning and ended up having a key role in writing it in the end. It wasn't meant to happen that way, but I was just so interested in it that I ended up getting involved. Really, it was my reflection of talking to members, doing surveys with members. And there's just this pervasive feeling that pay wasn't matching the reality of skill, of expertise and level of responsibility in nursing. It was also about voice. Right at the time I was thinking about the research, there was a kind of this sense of alarm about the lack of influence into key decision making about nursing and the nursing profession. It came on the back of the Francis inquiry, where there was a lot of blame put onto individual nurses and the profession. There were cuts to bursaries happening at the time in England. Also in England, spot the theme, there was the introduction of nursing associates, which I felt was done really without the involvement, certainly of the RCN and the professional voice of nursing. But overlaying all that, there's this feeling that other professions wouldn't be treated in the same way. Other male-dominated professions wouldn't be treated in the same way in terms of lack of voice and the rewards and the value and the status accruing to nursing. One thing I was keen to look at was the conundrum, the economic conundrum. So if you're faced with 40,000 plus vacancies in the NHS alone, why hasn't the profession been able to leave that situation into higher wages? So, you know, orthodox economics tells us that the understanding of labour supply and demand, that vacancies would lead to higher wages. So is the theory wrong, or is there something specific about nursing that bucks this theory? And I think it's a bit of both. We need to look at other theories and apply that to nursing as a unique workforce. As has been said, you know, it's absolutely obvious we're looking at a female-dominated and genderised workforce. It's a complex history that's left an underlying legacy for the workforce, the modern workforce. And in terms of theory, we need to look at pay, not just as a price in itself, but as a social practice. So the report goes into different theories about how the labour market works, and really underlines the need for us to look at how the social and historic processes of wage setting both shape and reflect gender, race and class. And that leads to this institutionalised undervaluing of jobs such as nursing, not just nursing, but as the single biggest female workforce in the UK. We feel it in a big way. And I think the other part of the puzzle really is the role of the NHS, both as the main monopsony employer in the economy, and the role of government as funder and policy driver, influencing nursing. It calls the shots on how the nursing workforce is paid. It holds the purse strings, and the RCN, as one of the main unions, we have to bargain with that whole weight of the government machinery. And that machinery, as we know, the last few weeks have been have put this in stark relief. It's held down pay for the last 10 years, and this is coming to light, particularly now. And that's had an impact on union strategy as well. We've been fighting against cuts, against austerity, against holding the line of what we've achieved before, and really being unable to fight for any more progressive change, I think. I mean, this machinery I'm talking about includes a pay structure for the nursing workforce, which is based on equal pay for equal value across the whole of the UK, across the whole of the Agenda for Change workforce. So on the one hand, you know, we have a strong, transparent structure which avoids damaging equal pay claims, pitting one group of staff against the other. But I think what's coming more and more obvious now is this tension between what we have, the highly centralised machinery of policy, regulation, collective bargaining, affecting the single largest workforce in the UK, as I've said. But in turn, they have a direct relationship with their local employer. And this plays out in different ways. But even though we do have an equality-proof pay structure, this isn't really helping those members, our RCN members, who feel that their employer is reluctant or unable to look at those job descriptions and look at them in a realistic way that matches that level of responsibility, expertise and skills that I started talking about. So we're dealing with this tension every day with this highly centralised machinery, which ensures equal pay for equal value, but in turn we're relying on employers and that employment relationship to be able to value individual nurses and nurses collectively. So I started out by saying, you know, as well as the pay levels and the safe staffing issues that are putting people off entering the profession, putting people off staying in the profession, it's that failure of reward generally to match what nursing really is. So even if we did manage to reach the 12.5 pay rise that we're asking for, it doesn't address this intrinsic problem of banding and job descriptions not reflecting the actual job that people do. So it's that reflection of what the job is hasn't kept up with changes in the nursing profession as it is. So I think there are kind of two. There's the big battles like Heather's talked about the image of nursing, but I think there's practical battles as well for trade unions, not just the big campaigning to get higher pay rises, but it's about this realistic reevaluation on a practical level. So I haven't actually talked about anything in the report. I've just talked about kind of where we are now, but I'm happy to take any questions about the report if anybody's read it. But as I said in my blurb, don't ask me anything about statistics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think you've just lined yourself up for a statistics question now. So thank you very much for that. I think even though you may not have directly referred to the report, I think you've raised some really topical issues that I think will be very relevant to people online. So before we move to our third speaker, can I encourage you to continue to post your questions on anything that has stimulated your thinking so far, or other thoughts that you have as we go through. So I'll move on to our third speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Lynn. Let me get her right here, Lynn Campbell, because I've known a little bit about the work that Lynn has been doing at Kelvin College in Glasgow. Lynn is a nurse by background, well, is a nurse, I don't know why we say that by background. Lynn is a nurse and is a lecturer at Kelvin College, and has been really kind of engaged in I guess what might be called a natural experiment around encouraging men into nursing, and so I'd be interested to hear more. So Lynn, hand over to you.
Thank you, Brendan, for that introduction. And again, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this evening's event. I thought I would give some background into the context of this as well within the college. And I would like to say that, first of all, we do have a variety of routes into the field of nursing within the college. So some of our students will come onto our programmes and start at our NQ levels or NC levels and progress up into HNC and then move on to university. Whereas other students will undertake our SWAP Widening Access programme, and it's that programme that I will focus on tonight, which we called it Men into Professional Care. As a college, we had already been doing some work in trying to address the gender stereotypes, so we had been invited into schools to discuss college courses, and we would send both from my team, we would send in a couple of lecturers, both male and female. And what was also surprising was that some of the younger students in the high schools were quite surprised when it was the male who said that he was the nurse. And he would challenge those stereotypes and those views and talk about what nursing actually was as a profession to get them thinking about that. And I do think that overall that is an important issue to look at when we're moving forward, is to tackle those stereotypes at a young age. At Kelvin College, we have currently four just now, but I'll talk about that in a second. We have 3 access to nursing courses. 2 are what we class as our care courses, which I look after, and 1 is a science route into nursing. But we began to look at this in general, and it was back in around about 2017-18 where there was the discussions, as Heather spoke around, through SWAP, through NES and CDN, and this was on the back of the Chief Nursing Officer's Widening Access report, that we began to look at the issues of gender. And obviously the Scottish Government had highlighted their interest as well. How could we attract but also retain men into nursing? And as Heather stated as well, we do have the Scottish Funding Council, in which we have to look at, and we are required to, through their Gender Action Plan, come up with strategies to recruit underrepresented groups if there is a gender imbalance in a subject area. And for us, that was men within our nursing programmes. So myself and SWAP had a discussion about this, and we devised, as Brendan called it, an experiment, looking at a programme that would be separate and didn't detract from our other nursing programmes, and we called it Men into Professional Care. But before we devised that, we met with our equality officer and manager within the college to look at that possibility, and it was decided that as we didn't meet the 25-75 ratio within our classes, that we would do a positive action pilot programme that would be for 3 years, which is coming to an end. And we would create that under our gender action plan. And the aim was to see, would having an all-male programme together, would that help attract, but would it also help to retain men moving on into the nursing profession? So I'd like to reiterate, again, it was a pilot to try to see if we could address this gender imbalance of men progressing into the field of nursing. Our numbers initially had been approximately 1 to 2 per class, which isn't a lot. We would maybe have 23, 24, 25 females in a group and 1 or 2 men. In the pilot groups, our first year and our second year, we had 15 males attending the programme, and this year we have 22. And their backgrounds have came from, when we've spoken to them, a variety of areas, including care, but also hospitality and construction. And they all said that they wanted a change, they wanted a different career, and that they had experienced role models within their family or their experiences, their own experiences within hospital, and they felt that moving into a career such as nursing would be a positive move for them. So we devised a curriculum round about that, and as normal, we always ask the students how we should devise and move the curriculum forward so that they can shape it, and we did the exact same with the men. And they helped us to shape the programme over the 3 years that we've been doing this. And what was interesting is that for the past 2 years, the subjects that come up the most that they felt was important for them with subjects around stress and stress management, and that's been particular for this year, and loss and grief. And they felt that these subjects were areas that they wished to explore more. I also made sure the timetables reflected that the access to nursing groups would all be in together, and that allowed us to do some blended learning with the groups and bring the teaching and learning at points within the academic, so the groups would come together throughout the academic year. Our figures have been so far that we have had a few dropouts within the classes which we've had, and Heather actually has highlighted some of the issues that we've faced. And it has been financial, has been their main reason for leaving. We also made sure the programme could be full-time, and we also tried it part-time to see if that would help us with the financial issues that they were experiencing. But some had to go and get full-time work. And there was a few that left for a few difficult reasons, and one that did leave is actually now back this year. Moving on into HE, we averaged approximately 10 students per year. Obviously this year we're not sure yet because the course isn't finished, but we've had 10 students per year moving on into higher education, with the majority moving on into nursing. We've had 1 into social work and 2 into paramedic science. Within nursing, what was interesting was that the majority moved on into adult nursing and learning disability. 1 moved into child nursing and a few moved into mental health. But we wanted to look at what the lessons learned from this has been over the past few years. And one of the things that has come out of this from the staff as well as the students when we have spoken to them is the first thing they said was relationships. They said that the programme allowed them to build relationships but sustain those relationships to move forward, and they felt that there was a mentorship within the class from their peers, and they felt that with the lecturers as well. But when they were asked, and it's a question that I've always been asked, but they will be moving on to university into what is classed as a predominantly female programme and career, they all said the same thing. We know this, but this is a career path that we have chosen, and the relationships that we have developed through this programme has enabled us to carry those relationships forward into university, which we felt was a really important thing. And what we noticed was that those relationships were developed in the college, not just in class, but we noticed that they would take lunch together, they would study together, they would support each other together, which I thought was a really important lesson. Second of all was confidence. And they said that they felt that having a course initially for them was that it allowed them to explore thoughts and ideas together. And they felt that it allowed them to build confidence in a safe space. And what some of them said was that when they moved on, or when they were together as a group with the other access to nursing students, that they felt more confident in expressing their own views. And one student stated that when he moved on to the HNC course, he felt the access programme had allowed him to develop confidence to openly express his thoughts, whereas he felt he maybe wouldn't have been able to do that before. Heather also brought up role models, which is again something that they brought up as well. And they said that they felt there was positive role models from the teaching staff, who was mixed of male and female nurses, as well as social care staff. But on top of that, they said there was peer role models. The group was a mixed age. They were a mix of school leavers, which normally SWAP don't have, but we had opened that up. So this intergenerational relationship we felt was really important, and we feel that lessons need to be learned from that and how we do support our younger students. But what they said was that being in a mixed class with some older male peers allowed them to have positive role models there as well as developing those positive relationships, and they felt that they learned a lot from their peers. This year the programme comes to an end, and we will be doing an integrated, a more gender balanced approach next year, and one of the group currently has a 50-50 split of male and female. And we would like to take the lessons learned forward within this programme to see how this approach can be moved forward, to see if we can still attract and retain men within the nursing career. But finally, I do recognise that no programme is perfect, but I do think we need to take a lot of lessons learned from this programme to move forward, because I do believe that nursing should be a profession for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. That's really fascinating, and I think so much to learn from it, and it's obviously provoked lots of questions which will be coming your way a bit later, so thank you very much for that. It's my pleasure to introduce our fourth speaker, Leanne Patrick. I think I first met Leanne through the Council of Dean's Student Leadership Programme, and since then she's gone on to be a specialist nurse in domestic abuse and sexual violence with NHS Fife. Previously, to being a nurse, Leanne had a role in journalism and writing editorials and writing a lot of commentaries to do with gender, women and women's rights and sexual harassment. So I know Leanne has some interesting perspectives to pose on this. So Lynn, I keep calling you Lynn. Leanne, I'll hand over to you.
I think I was muted. So thank you. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I had some technical issues getting here, but I think I'll just get stuck in straight away. So if I could go to the slides, please, that would be great. So, as mentioned, my name's Leanne Patrick and I'm a specialist nurse in domestic abuse and sexual violence. I'm going to be talking to you today about men in nursing recruitment campaigns and some of the considerations relating to the research, the campaign rhetoric and the support or participation these campaigns have received. Next slide, please. So, a little bit of context to the current recruitment and retention issues facing the profession. In Scotland, we have upwards of 4,000 nursing and midwifery vacancies. And if we scale that up to include the rest of the UK, we're looking at about or above 40,000 vacancies. So we're looking at a significant deficit, which has clear, important implications for patient safety and standards of care. It's common to see, as part of men in nursing recruitment campaign rhetoric, that men may be an untapped resource of recruitment potential because they're currently such a small percentage of the workforce. But some of the research from the previous speakers point out that we're struggling to retain men and that there are only so many kind of spaces available to fill. Next slide, please. In Scotland, we're seeing quite a bit of research on the topic of recruiting men and retaining men within the workforce. And I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the research recently commissioned by NES. In particular, what the authors don't say or what they don't consider versus what they do. So the research essentially finds that men in nursing experience stigma and negative comments for being a nurse or a student nurse. The research is highly sympathetic toward the male participants and positions female participants at points as not understanding the struggles of their male nursing colleagues. And it does this whilst being really uncritical of what the men are actually saying. If we take a deeper look at the responses, we begin to see some of the troubling attitudes. The first quote on this page speaks about lamenting a lack of a laddish culture. The research goes on to talk about how men and women communicate differently and how men are penalised for this. It doesn't say that a laddish culture is a feature of toxic masculinity, and it doesn't challenge whether such a thing is appropriate within our profession. The next two quotes are from the men themselves, and they speak of girls gossiping when referring to their adult female colleagues conversing and how they feel isolated from this. The research doesn't comment on the obvious misogyny in the derogatory reference. Girls gossip and lads need a laddish counterculture is spoken really clearly by the participants, but the discussion of these attitudes is not present in the analysis. And then there's the notion of consent. The research speaks of men having to seek double consent with female patients and how this makes them feel uncomfortable. And whilst there are some important discussions surrounding consent to be had and how we can ensure learning experiences aren't compromised, one of the suggested strategies the authors go on to make essentially steamrollers the notion of additional consent for men. And when 1/3 of women are victims of domestic abuse and 1/5 are survivors of sexual violence, it's invariably at the hands of men. So when men ask for consent on that basis, it's a sign of cultural competence, their values and their ethics. So that the authors go on to recommend not asking for consent is something I find quite troubling. And finally, at the end, you can see a collection of quotes about the source of stigma that men are receiving. It's coming from, invariably, their male friends and family, something that's totally external to the profession and rooted again in this toxic masculinity, talking about the profession being a bit puffy. And so when we speak about needing to change the image of nursing and make it more gender neutral, we have to be asking, whose comfort are we doing that for? And what are we condoning in the process? The research goes on to suggest that a national strategy is needed to change the image of the profession in response to this. Next slide, please. So what do we know about the situation so far? Men typically account for around 10 to 11% of the nursing workforce, and that figure has been largely static over the years. And what we often hear from this is that men are underrepresented within the profession. And despite this, we can see that men are overrepresented in positions of leadership and management. This also applies to nursing academia. Men in nursing progress faster, further, and with fewer qualifications than their female counterparts. So men are often working at an advantage as soon as they enter nursing despite their small numbers. And I think that there are two key aspects to this problem. The first is that women often take career breaks to have children or work part-time, and they take on caring responsibilities in relation to this, which means that men in nursing essentially are no more likely to share responsibility for childcare than in any other profession. So there's wider social issues already at play. And the second is this kind of issue of education. If men are still progressing faster and further within the profession, despite fewer qualifications on average, and if we look at this in the context of women taking career breaks or working part-time, what we see is likely or potentially this notion of time served versus skill being a potential factor in hiring decisions. So overall, what we can see is that nursing is not really operating any differently than any other profession in terms of the patriarchal structures that benefit men and that disadvantage women. Next slide, please. So if we look to our sociology colleagues who are discussing this issue objectively, we can see that there are some concerns regarding the narrative and rhetoric embedded in men in nursing campaigns specifically. And Marcy Cottingham's analysis speaks again to this advantage that men have within the nursing profession in terms of pay and promotion. She also highlights the role of organisations in promoting men in nursing campaigns, which has given them even more of an advantage as a result. And she suggests this is occurring thanks to the rhetoric of men as a minority, as underrepresented, and as being in need of equality and diversity strategies, which essentially draws a parallel between a universally privileged group and the oppression of women and people of colour. It frames it as a problem and an injustice that needs to be addressed, rather than the result of wider social misogynies and homophobia. We saw this from the words of the men in the research used to justify the need for these campaigns. Next slide, please. Looking again to our sociology colleagues, we can get a sense of how a boost in numbers of men within a female majority profession has played out. So what previous research has found is that when men enter a profession, the pay tends to increase, which is great. However, it also leads to women being pushed out, and we start to see the same issues of gender pay gaps, inflexible working, and overrepresentation in leadership, which we already see in nursing, despite men being 10 to 11% of the workforce. And then on the flip side, when women enter a typically male majority profession, research has found that wages subsequently decrease. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about what's beneath this issue, we can start to see it's all connected by the same thing, the undervaluing of women and the work that they do, whatever that work is. So whilst nursing might see an increase in pay and even value if we attract more men, it will be at the expense of women. I've outlined a series of recommendations that I think summarise the points I've made so far in relation to ethics, attitudes to women, and these pervasive structural misogynies. These can't really be an afterthought in these campaigns. They have to be kind of central to the ethics of it. But I wanted to just finish by highlighting the work of Caroline Criado Perez, who's found that when we speak of becoming gender neutral, we can rarely achieve this without becoming gender blind. Time and time again, all around the world, over and over, gender neutral becomes this one size fits all that invariably conforms to the needs of the default man. And nursing's no different, and we can see these attitudes and structural misogynies exist in the profession already. So I'd just like to leave you with the question, for whose benefit is gender neutrality? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leanne. That posed some big challenges that, again, are being picked up in the Q&A. So I think we will come back to those, but also I think they help to contextualise, perhaps, and theorise some of the issues that have already been raised. So that is great. So thank you very much, and glad you got your IT sorted so you could do the presentation and be with us. So moving on to our final speaker, and then we will move into the Q&A session. It's my pleasure to introduce Kev Head, and Kev is the Student Experience Manager at Edinburgh Napier University's School of Health and Social Care. Got a background in higher education, predominantly been with pre-registration nursing and midwifery students, and focusing on pastoral support and developing a range of initiatives to enhance recruitment and retention. So I'll hand over to you, Kev, for your talk. You're muted.
Thank you, Brendan. Someone had to do it, didn't they? Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, everyone, for the invite today. Just looking to talk to you a little bit about a recruitment, male-focused recruitment initiative at Edinburgh Napier University. At Edinburgh Napier, we have a large nursing and midwifery intake, around about 600 students coming in every year. And within that intake, we encompass all 4 fields of nursing practice and midwifery. My role at the school is a student experience manager. That started off originally as a kind of a solo pastoral support role for pre-registration students, but that's now increased a little bit into a team of 3, which has got a breadth of responsibility around student support, student experience more generally. So there's a broad variety of work we're involved in. There's lots included with that around support, retention, employability, but also recruitment. At Edinburgh Napier, we take quite a longitudinal approach to the student journey. I suppose we look at it as being from application right through to employment, and as part of that, our recruitment process, even though there's large numbers, we try and keep that very personalised, very individualised, and working with students as individually as possible to make sure they're as ready as possible when they come to apply to study with us. That recruitment angle, I'll keep that very much at the focus for today, and looking at a specific piece of recruitment activity that we've been involved with for 3 or 4 years now. Just to set the context, some of our programmes do select rather than recruit. So we've got all 4 fields of nursing practice and midwifery, and while midwifery and child are very popular in terms of applications, far more applications than places, some of the other fields of nursing practice are less so, and we're very actively needing to recruit onto those programmes. So in those areas particularly, but also overall, our recruitment target is really large, and so I suppose that's one of the reasons. I think there's 3 reasons. That's one of the reasons why we've looked to do this piece of work. So we are looking for more nurses, especially into more student nurses, especially in some fields of practice. We've already heard about the Scottish Funding Council targets today around trying to increase gender underrepresented programmes. So we currently sit at around 8 to 11%, depending year on year, in terms of male intake for us. So that's a very big gap to get to the 25% that the Scottish Funding Council is setting. But for us, there is a bit of a principle as well. I think we are looking for a diversity of intake in all forms, not just around gender, but a diversity of intake into our programmes, hoping that will result in greater diversity into the workforce 3 years further down the line, I suppose. So the initiative specifically was to run, its simple idea really is to run specific male men into nursing and midwifery information evenings, a 2-hour evening once or twice a year, specifically targeted at male applicants. the input was designed to be a Q&A style session, so we would have 3 or 4 male nurses or members of staff within the school or current nursing students to talk about their experience, their journey, I suppose, how they got to the point that they were at that moment in time. A bit of tour of the facility, spending some time within our simulation and clinical skills centre, and then finishing that up, which I think quite importantly, with some individualised advice and guidance around their application, trying to ensure that all of those applicants are as application ready as possible when they actually come to apply to us through UCAS. I suppose to stress it's complementary to our existing work. All of our work around recruitment is quite intensive and it's quite individualised. All applicants can get this kind of one-to-one time to talk through their application when they request it. But the events themselves, I think, are trying to create a bit of a critical mass of male student staff and applicants, finding that quite in the hope, I suppose, that would be a supportive, encouraging environment and create some role modelling for those people coming forward as well. I suppose reflecting on those events, thinking positively about it, one thing I think it was great to see, we were seeing applicants at really various stages of the journey of being ready to come onto the programme. So some had already been invited to interview. To be honest, they had everything they needed. They're very much in place to start with us later that year. Others needing to access more education before being anywhere near ready to apply to come onto the programme. But again, we were able to give the advice on that. A range of ages as well. So feeding back into what Lynn was saying, there's an intergenerational aspect to that. I think people who were at different points in the journey towards becoming a student nurse, but also different ages. We had school leavers right through to people who were kind of career changers or much older. Also, I think what maybe surprised us a little when we first started doing this is a great variety and motivation. It really challenged the stereotypes of either male applicants really wanting to go into fast-paced technical environments, but also we needed to encourage that at all. When we were having our discussions in the groups, there was lots of lived experience being shared, whether that's personal or work-based, and the variety of environments that people thought they'd be interested in working in further down the line were as varied as the people who were coming along, and that was really, I think, healthy and encouraging to see. We see lots of the faces again through the journey, even if it's a couple of years later, coming on to the programmes later on. So it feels to us like it's quite an effective intervention in terms of, I guess, shoring these applicants up, getting them to a place where they're really coming into the able to come onto the programme, and they're really positively received. They're enjoyable events. I think we all enjoy them, staff included. But I think we need to be honest about these things as well. I don't think they're going to fix the issue or really drive those numbers up. The numbers coming to the events are very small. We get double figures if we're lucky. Sometimes it's sort of 7-8 people coming along. So it's certainly no sort of answer to the bigger issues of numbers coming through the programme. And I suppose just to reinforce something that Heather was saying earlier on as well, we've done quite a lot of work with our male data on the programme, looking at numbers of male students applying, receiving an offer, accepting that offer, and then retention through the programme. And we don't really see any particular obvious issues along that pipeline for us. Our retention for male students is comparable, certainly, to female students. In terms of those numbers, it really does seem from our perspective to be about the number of men actually considering nursing and midwifery in the first place, and maybe feeding into those wider cultural things that we've been talking about. I'm kind of aware of time, so I'll stop it there, but hopefully that's of some interest. Thanks for your time.
Unmute, and I thought it was. There we go. Thank you very much for that, Kev, and I think again it raises some interesting perspectives that maybe challenge some of the dominant earlier issues around recruitment and retention, in particular, that we may pick up on. So we've had a significant number of questions coming through, and myself and some of my RCN colleagues have been trying to keep a map of those and try and theme them into a reasonable number. Again, we've got about 30 minutes for these questions. So I'm going to invite the panel, as I say, back on stage, and I'm going to field these questions. I may just target particular people as we go, if you don't mind, or we'll just put them out generally, and hopefully one of you will pick them up. It's fair to say that people have been exercised by a number of issues. So there are some some more general issues, I think, and then some very specific ones that we will try to pick up on this evening that I think really kind of reflect the diversity of the perspectives that we've heard this evening and some of the challenges that we're all trying to face. So the first question, I think it probably does go to Heather, and Heather, there's probably a bunch of questions here about the evidence really around male interest generally in widening the nursing cause. So this very strong view, I think, that's coming through, which is that, you know, men who come into nursing should be interested in the whole agenda of nursing as a social movement generally, and not just coming in for male interest. What is your kind of view on this, that you know, what we should be doing is not about the kind of the misogyny argument that Leanne posed to us, but actually that the real issue here is about trying to address the general issues for nursing, and that men have a part to play in that?
Thank you, Brendan. I'm not entirely sure what you're asking me. Could you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, I think it's more this issue that, you know, there is a huge issue about gender in nursing, and it's not to kind of, in a sense, to polarize it into a male-female issue, detracts from the real issue, which is that of addressing the social imbalances in a way that exist in nursing, and what your views are about that.
Well, I think we have to promote nursing as an attractive profession, and promote the skills and attributes of a nurse, not regardless of gender. Nursing is a I don't think we can get away from the fact nursing is a gendered profession, but to make it attractive to all, we need to be looking for high caliber applicants with good qualifications, and emphasizing the communication skills. It's not just about caring, there's technical skills, decision-making skills, all attributes which are not exclusive to women. I'm not sure I've entirely answered your question, but happy to expand further.
I think it gets there. I think the question was very much challenging this kind of, in a way, kind of binary gender discussion that we inevitably end up caught up in when we introduce the notion of gender and nursing, which is that, you know, men have a particular motivation, but there are, you know, thousands more female nurses in the profession, and we should be driven by those same issues that women have in nursing, rather than us kind of claiming that space as trying to increase a male perspective, which I think was Leanne's point as well within all of this. So I don't know if, Leanne, you wanted to come in on some of that.
Yeah, I think Heather's right. I think the best way to attract people into the profession is to highlight all the best things about this profession. So I think it was Johns Hopkins University released a video last year, I'm not sure if everybody's seen that, about nursing, what a skilled profession it is, all the different kind of things that are involved in being a nurse, being political, just a really rounded view of nursing that we don't tend to see here. And then over in England, or the UK, but via NHS England, what we see is these really gendered campaigns and videos of men doing power stances and, you know, running through A&E and being really hyper masculine. So I don't think we're really nailing it there either. We're not really showing the best of nursing, what an intellectual profession it is, and really challenging those other stereotypes that nursing has. So I think we do need the best people. And I think the best way to do that is to focus on things like that.
Great. And so moving on to a second question, which was really very specific around the impact assessment of government-driven initiatives. And this question came from Kat Barber. And it was about, given that we know the outcomes for women have been poor when men have joined female-dominated professions, what are the panel's thoughts on the lack of risk analysis for male-centred recruitment drives? I don't know, Rachel, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think I think a few people have said, pointed to this sort of quite stark economics argument that more men in nursing will shift pay up. And there's lots of issues around that. I can see Craig's put some sentiments in the chat which I would completely agree with. But I think the bigger thing for me is we can't wait. We can't wait for things to change. We can't wait for society to catch up or to change or more men. We can't wait for things to happen. I think we need to be looking at the interventions ourselves that we can do, whether it's through trade union representation, which is obviously my perspective, or nurses as their own advocates or academics. It's that's going to shift, not waiting for everybody else to agree with us. So when every year I give evidence to the peer review body, and they have this kind of question that's almost at the bottom of their list about the equality impact assessment, and I could talk all night about the peer review body and whether that's working for nursing. Probably do another webinar on that, but it is so much of an afterthought. And every year we tell them 55% of our members are the sole or main breadwinner in their own households, and that's even starker amongst BME members. So everything that you do, everything the government does, impacts on not only the biggest, I keep saying it, the biggest single female workforce, but it's impacting on those households as well. It's impacting on their spending power in their own communities. It impacts on their status and what their image is to their children and their communities. But like I say, every year it's like this tiny afterthought, and it never gets taken seriously. And I think it's because there isn't a gender pay gap, so it doesn't get picked up in nursing. There isn't a gender pay gap because everybody's paid equally as badly. There's a glass escalator, obviously, where men rise to the top quicker, but we have an equality-proof pay structure that means that there is transparency. So because the stats don't show a gender pay gap, there is nothing to kind of report on. There's no lever for us to say you need to look at this seriously. I'm not sure I answered the question. It's a bit roundabout there.
No, I think it does. I think it really illustrates some of the complexity of that whole impact assessment. And certainly, as somebody who's just led the equality impact assessment work for some of our ref submission at the university, then I can certainly connect with what you mean about where it sits within the whole process, and we could probably have a whole all-night discussion about that. I think the issue you raised about the equality pay structure, which is everybody is paid badly, is actually something that's been referred to by a number of comments in the Q&A relating to that data around, men coming into a dominant female profession, drives women out, but actually we are all paid on the same equal badly basis, really. But it's the escalator, as you say, that is the issue. Heather, I think you wanted to come in on this as well. So.
Thanks, Brendan. Yes, I entirely agree about the men seem to progress more quickly in their careers, but I think that's a completely separate issue, and I don't think it's an argument for not bringing more men into the profession. We have the same in academia. Female academics are less likely to progress in their careers up to the professoriate. I think that's more to do with the way we support people who take career breaks, people who go part-time, and to support women develop their leadership skills and their confidence. I think women are, you know, the old adage that women will apply for promotion when they feel they're ready for it, whereas men are more likely to apply for promotion before they're ready for it. And so, you know, those are the challenges that nursing needs to address to support. Women are more likely to take career breaks, they're more likely to go be part-time, but we need to support all the whole workforce to allow them to maintain a work-life balance and for their careers to progress regardless of these things. I mean, for me, I've heard from quite a few people, male friends, male commentators, about how they would be reluctant or less inclined to have intimate care provided by a woman. And I entirely hear what Leanne is saying about consent. I think you're entirely right. We have to ask for consent. The point about the consent was about the male student nurses feel different. That was one example of many where they are picked out because the double consent. But I think consent is really important. But the point is 50% of our patients are men. Women will be asked if they are happy for their care to be provided by a nurse who's a man. The same privilege is not afforded to our female patients. To our male patients. We make an assumption that our male patients are quite happy to have intimate care provided by a female nurse, and if they're not, in many clinical areas there are no nurses who are men to provide that care. So I think for our client group we need to redress the balance and to allow choice for them. But I think supporting women through their careers or supporting people who go part-time is another aspect which I think is separate. I don't think it's I don't think that's a reason for not bringing more men into the profession. Thank you.
I think you've raised something really tricky around the male patient's choice about carer, but I think Leanne is desperate to get in here. So was it about this comment?
I mean, I feel like this impact assessment question has become a bit of a reply moment to some of the things that I raised earlier. And there's quite a lot to reply to here because there's been a few different points raised. So the first one is this idea that there isn't a gender pay gap. There is. If men are progressing further, then there's an imbalance in pay, and it's not justified. We know that men aren't inherently better. And then I suppose it comes to this idea of, do we need to address this differently and separately? We don't. It's inherent to the whole campaign. If we do this, we disadvantage women, and that's the whole point of an impact assessment, is thinking about, if we make this a separate thing that other people can figure out and not us while we go ahead with the campaign, who's going to do it? Who's thinking about the women? It's inherent, surely, to any good research and any good policy that you think about the negative impacts of that. And then the other thing that I think was really quite wrong is this idea that there's a parallel between women who provide intimate care for men and men who provide intimate care for women. You know, when we look at the stats for people who are affected by domestic abuse and sexual violence, it absolutely dwarfs the number of men who are affected by this. You know, the kind of power dynamics in society and the structural misogynies that women deal with day after day after day. And then I suppose to draw that parallel is to really overlook what that is like for women to have intimate care provided when they've been through something like that. I do work with these women every day, and it is something that is incredibly difficult. And the reason why it has to be different is because of the number of women that are affected by this. It's, you know, epidemic levels, the violence against women. And so when we think about this as a kind of broad concept, and we do have to think about it as a broad concept and put all these things together, we think about, you know, the issue of violence against women and how women's inequality is both a cause and consequence of that violence. So if we aren't addressing women's inequality, then we're essentially complicit in that violence. But I don't think it's right at all to draw parallels with men receiving intimate care. And I think this is the concern that I have about gender blindness, just kind of a blanket policy approach to pay, to personal care, to all of those things that doesn't look at these really important factors that are researched, evidenced and understood but just don't seem to be acknowledged.
Okay, so I think some really challenging perspectives brought up here, because I can totally get the point you're making, Leanne, about wider society and the stats about violence against women and power by men. I wonder if within a nursing context, though, we should be trying to in some way neutralize that through the theories, through the practices that we are all educated through. Does that in itself bring some kind of neutralizing of those wider society perspectives, which perhaps is, I think, is where Heather was going with this? That do we just apply the same principles, or is there not something about the way we're educated, developed, understanding what nursing is about, that actually tries to neutralize some of that may get away from that perspective?
But it doesn't. So if we look at even statistics about, and we don't have much on patients, violence against nurses in the workforce, 45% of nurses have experienced some form of sexual harassment, and that comes from their male colleagues, it comes from sometimes patients, and sometimes it comes from other clinicians. But we're seeing that it actually happens. So despite all this education, these misogynies still exist within the profession, and the only way to kind of educate people on this issue is to be really specific about it. And I'm not sure that I believe that that's enough necessarily when we're looking at these structural, societal, broad messages and the devaluing women across the board. And I think to position, I suppose, men's discomfort with having to ask for consent again, in my line of work, I have to ask for consent every single time I do anything. And that's as a woman working with women who are affected by sexual violence and domestic abuse. I ask them for every phone call, if it's safe to call them, I ask for consent, and it is embedded into the job. And it's no hardship to me. I don't take it personally. It's not about me. And so it shouldn't be about men and their discomfort when you're dealing with intimate care of somebody who could have been affected by violence.
Yep, no, I absolutely get that. And I think we could probably spend the rest of this time debating this one particular issue, because it is really fascinating, really interesting. And just to say, I think there is a bunch of issues that is surfaces that we probably don't have the time to go into, but it's about how do we balance this kind of issue that is being raised here, and at the same time, in a way, and I'm going to use the word protect kind of inappropriately, men in nursing, that they don't feel pushed out because of these issues. So somehow we have got a balance to try and strike, where at the one hand we have to raise these issues and these misogynies and power imbalances, etc. But on the other hand, these are the same issues that will drive men out of nursing or not bring us in at all. And that same issue is about with the glass ceiling argument. And I'm going to come on to Rachael and Lynn, because I want to get to a bunch of questions quickly into both of you, about the misogyny argument that drives through this glass ceiling issue, which is that, we only get to the top because we're men rather than because we're actually capable of doing the job. If we keep giving out that message, then what does that do to those of us who might be in those positions feeling very guilty about doing so? So, I think there's some careful ethical, moral positioning here that perhaps goes wider than just some straight sociological issues. So just because of time, there was a bunch of questions. Firstly, I'm going to go to Lynn, which was around the whole programme. And the questions, I guess, aren't the same theme, but really about, the kind of, in a sense, that those men who are thinking about becoming nurses, or you're hoping might become nurses, which is around, why do we need to have these safe spaces? Is that not just protecting some of these, misogynies that are being talked about here? Is this not really about a really good example of the need to reform the profession generally, rather than creating these protected spaces? A whole load of questions about access criteria, and you're not just poaching men from other health and social care professions. So lots and lots of questions, which I think will be fed to you anyway. But I just wondered if you could comment, Lynn, as a bunch of questions around, how you see this kind of experiment, and I think it is a great experiment, feeding into some of these wider issues that are being debated here this evening.
Obviously, the part, Brendan, you brought up there about a safe space. I believe that all students, regardless of who they are, whether they're male or female, whether they're from the BME community, whether they have a disability. Everyone should have a safe space to talk, regardless of who they are. I work in the East End of Glasgow, and many of our students come with, I don't like to use the word, but baggage, and we would always allow people to have a safe space. I mean, this came from the men, but what I would say is, talking to our female groups as well, they feel the same way, that they want to have a safe space to explore views and thoughts. And we very much at the very beginning of our programme put in value-based units as well, to challenge people's ideas and perceptions around some of the things that Heather and Leanne have brought up tonight. And I think we have to start at the grassroots, and I think that, to be honest, we tried this programme to see if it would work and attract more men into the profession. But I do believe we need to start younger. And I think Leanne brought up the point about the John Hopkins, I think it was, University, Leanne, you said, with the video. And I think some of the most important work that we have done has been challenging school children and what their perception of nursing actually is. That nursing isn't and should not just be a female-orientated profession. It should be a profession for everyone, regardless of their background, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their gender, their sexual orientation. I mean, we've had many students on the programme that are transgender, from the LGBT community, a lot of Black and ethnic minority groups as well. And I think all groups should be supported to enter into a profession that we know is wonderful, but I don't think many people do, because they see it in such a stereotypical way that Leanne highlighted at the beginning. It is female only, and that the males that go into it are classed in particular ways as well. And we have to actually challenge these stereotypes, I think, from the very beginning. Yeah. And but I think it's been very interesting for us, because a lot of the staff at the beginning were very much against the programme, but by the end have enjoyed the experiment, have enjoyed the experience. But I think what has come out of it is that we need to recognise that regardless of who that individual is that we need to create safe spaces, whether it's at college or indeed at universities, to allow people to explore their ideas, and we can maybe challenge those ideas in a very safe way.
Great, thank you. No, it's really, really important message. And Kev, I did wonder, did you want to comment on that in a sense, in how you've carried that through into what you were talking about in relation to then the pre-registration programs themselves, this idea of safe space? Does that connect with why you're not seeing a large attrition rate among the male students?
Possibly, Brendan. I suppose especially as a large programme as well, we do take 50, 60, 70 males in every year. So there is a larger group of men, I suppose, around and about. Yeah. And you will see a lot of those men gravitating together, I suppose, and naturally starting to form these groups. So I suppose that's a potential that we and other large programmes would have, whereas smaller programmes would find that more, may find that more difficult. That could be a contributing factor. And we're certainly really keen to try and roll forward the kind of the male specific information evening into the programme a little bit more, create opportunities, a bit of community building, but that shouldn't be exclusive. I think it's giving those opportunities to dip in and to dip out, to bring those communities together, but hopefully to create an environment people do feel safe, supported, a sense of belonging, whether with their male peers or with their female peers, but I think creating options where that can realistically happen is hopefully positive towards people staying on the programme.
Great, thank you. Now we're rapidly running out of time, but I just want to, Rachel, you've got a 30-second platform, because the thing that I took from the report more than anything was about wages as a social practice. And I think it captures so many of the questions that have been asked about pay and salaries and glass ceilings and so much tonight. I won't ask you to talk about any stats in relation to it, but could you give us a very quick 30-second kind of overview of your perspective on this, about wages as a social practice?
The thing that really stood out for me when I did do some stats, it's just the more complex stats. The stats that stood out for me, we were careful not to get into sort of rabbit holes of comparing male professions, but what we did was compare the nursing profession to the other professions in healthcare, and compared to those, the standard deviation was so much lower in nursing, so that the range of earnings is more compressed in nursing. So it's what I was talking about, nurses go through the career build their skills, experience, knowledge, responsibility, but don't get rewarded for it across the lifetime of their career. So that's the thing for me. That's the biggest finding that was quite worrying for me. Even if you stay at the same band, or if you progress, it doesn't really make much difference to that range of earnings across the whole profession. That's not just the NHS, that's across the whole economy. That's the biggest thing.
Great, thank you very much. And I do think there is so much to unpack within that sadly we don't have time to do, but I think it is a really, really interesting perspective that underpins a lot of what's being discussed here. So it is my role to try and bring this to a conclusion, given we're just rapidly running out of time. And I guess, firstly, there is so much that this surfaces, and I think one webinar like this is not going to do it. But I think what it does do, hopefully, is open up a space that we can start to have a wider and deeper conversation about this. One of the issues, of course, we haven't touched on tonight, and for me, it's one of the reasons why I dislike the binary nature of this argument is about the whole transgender positioning within all of this and other genders, and how do we actually take account of that really huge diversity that exists and needs to exist within nursing and healthcare. And I think in many ways that is a topic for discussion in itself, and I hope we come back to that one evening ourselves. I guess the discussion raises some important issues, and I just kind of maybe highlight three that maybe come together here. One, I think, is that binary nature of this discussion and the need to get away from that. And I think all of our speakers have raised some of the wider societal sociological perspectives that show we need to be looking at the profession as a whole rather than male and female versions of it, and how do we hold on to that, but being cautious, as Leanne did raise, about how gender neutrality can become gender blindness, and how do we avoid doing that, I think is really important. I guess for me it's opened up huge moral and ethical issues around consent, around positioning, around roles, and how we actually take those forward. And I think there's a huge really programme of work for all of us, particularly I guess those of us involved in higher education, in preparing these students to actually be conscious of these as really important central issues within our programmes. And it does raise for me around theory and how we are positioning theories to shape all of this and to help future nurses take account of it. And lastly, there is no doubt that we are, of course, part of a wider societal problem around gender, and we can't avoid that, and we can't deny it, and we have to try and work with it. But I guess there is something for me about how we use theory, how we use our knowledge to try and not be the same as other professions, not be the same as wider societal things, but to actually try and shape a different future for nursing and healthcare, and for people who we provide services to. So I found this to be a fascinating discussion. I think we could have had about another hour for discussion, and I know we had enough questions to keep that discussion going. So to those people who we've not addressed your questions specifically, I apologise for that, but I hope that in other ways your questions and your issues have been raised and addressed, and that you have enjoyed the perspectives that have come up here tonight. And finally, could I thank our speakers, that's Heather, Leanne, Rachael, Lynn and Kev, for some really fascinating perspectives and for really holding this space with us this evening. I think it's a space we probably want to keep open and carry on talking. And finally, thank you to the Royal College of Nursing for hosting this event and for inviting me to be chair. I feel very privileged and honoured to have done so. And thank all our participants and for coming along and joining in this webinar this evening, and have a good evening.